Disclaimer, everything talked about in this video is purely fictional. Any similarity to real world society is purely coincidental. Cars is a franchise about cars, surprisingly. Planes is a franchise about planes. The people who came up with these names are geniuses, and I'll never be able to be quite as amazing. But here's the thing. Cars and planes aren't just about cars and planes. They're about all kinds of vehicles, and that kinda starts to cause problems when you think about how each type of vehicle is treated. Let's look at something very simple, vehicle autonomy, and see what situations that gets us in. Cars seem to be the default vehicle. This makes sense considering the title of the series, so we'll start there. Cars have a decent amount of autonomy. They can drive most places that have any kind of flatness, even if most are better suited for actual roads, as cars generally are. They can't do some things, as they don't exactly have hands, though some similar vehicles like tow trucks do have an equivalent. But other than that, they don't need to ask for help or get different accommodations most of the time. The world also seems to be mostly built for cars. Most doors and buildings are for car-sized vehicles, which causes problems for vehicles like trucks, like Mac in Cars, who is so disrespected that his name is literally just the type of truck he is. Trucks almost have all the autonomy of a car, except nothing is built for their size, so they can't really get into most buildings or down a lot of roads. Trucks would be completely fine if there were any kind of accommodations for them, but there aren't, to the point where they sleep outside. They don't even have little hotel things for them when they're driving across the country. That's kind of messed up. Things start to go real downhill from here. Next up is planes. Planes have about as much autonomy as cars and trucks, except they just straight up can't go to most places because they're too big. Even small planes like Dusty in Planes aren't exactly seen on the road. This would be fine, after all, they're planes and they can fly. Why would they want to drive around except for the existence of airports? Airports are the only place where planes can take off and land, and they don't seem to have much existence outside of airports. There are a few instances where planes are not seen in hangars or about to take off, but those are mostly in the stands of plane races, or, in rare cases, parties. So planes should have a lot of autonomy, as technically they're not as restricted in terms of movement and the ability to do things as cars, but they don't. One would presume mostly because of their size and them seeming to only be allowed to fly everywhere. This becomes a major issue in cases like what sets off the plot of Planes 2, where Dusty's airport is threatened to be shut down because the fire truck for the airport is too old, which would make Dusty literally homeless and not even be able to visit the area because he's not allowed to land there. Helicopters are pretty similar to planes, but technically have slightly more autonomy than planes, which makes sense because they don't technically need a runway. We know this because we see them in places that aren't airports or plane races, like car races, as employees. Listen, I'm not saying they have a lot more autonomy, just that they have a little more. They also lose some autonomy because they can't even drive around on the ground. They have to fly. Just like blimps, who, besides the fact that they're even harder to land, probably would have about the same amount of autonomy as planes and helicopters, and whatever other flying vehicles you can think of, including possibly satellites. Satellites exist, but considering that they're only ever mentioned and we never actually see them, who knows if they're alive or intelligent or anything. We're gonna hope they're not, because being stuck in space for your entire life is just sad. Then there's boats. Now, boats are interesting. We don't see a lot about boats, but we do know they are intelligent. We know this because of the many boats we see through Cars 2, who talk. Now, of course, talking doesn't necessarily mean intelligence, but it's a pretty good indicator. But then things get weird. See, in planes, there's an aircraft carrier, the USS Eisenhower. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with that. First, it's an aircraft carrier, which means it's literally the home of a bunch of planes. That's already weird. But then we look at the fact that it's literally named as a pun of the USS Eisenhower, which presumably means it was named after a president, and also has the title USS. Now, if the Eisenhower is intelligent, none of this seems okay in the slightest. But it might not be. After all, the few times we see it, it doesn't talk at all, and no one talks to it either, which either means no one wants to talk to it, we just aren't shown it talking, or it's not intelligent. However, it's also wearing a hat, which would imply intelligence. I'm going to choose that it's not intelligent and someone just put a hat on it like you might do with an animal, because that's the least upsetting version. This kind of works as it is an extremely large boat. We have extremely small cars, bug-sized, act like bugs, so it does kind of make sense for an extremely large boat to be just an animal equivalent type thing. But back to the autonomy. Now, we don't see a whole lot of boats because there needs to be water for them, and there's not a whole lot of water in the Worlds of Cars movies, which is fine. That means that while boats don't really have a whole lot of autonomy on land, they have a whole lot where they'll be all the time, on the water. Technically, they have even more autonomy than cars, as cars are mostly restricted by roads, whereas boats can more easily go anywhere on the ocean. Boats could absolutely have a thriving society on the ocean that we just don't see because the movies aren't about them. So, as far as we know, boats are doing just fine. What aren't doing fine are the trains. Trains, as far as I'm concerned, have it the worst. While the world might not be built for other vehicles, at least they aren't confined to a track, and that's their entire life. Trains, on the other hand, it's a train. That's how trains work. Better yet, the few trains we see are solely for moving cars, which means they're built for a purpose, and that's it. Now, admittedly, even some cars are built for a purpose. Lightning is a race car, and that's all he'll ever be. Doing what you're built for is part of the main plot of planes, technically. And some vehicles, like cargo planes and Mac from Cars, have the same exact problem of transport too, so it's not too bad. It's just that cars and planes can actually go places, at least a little bit, while trains can only follow their track, and that's it. Now, you may think, well, maybe they're not an intelligent species of vehicle, but nope. We get a very clear scene of one talking to a car inside him, and that's our best way of figuring out whether vehicles are human or animal equivalent. So we actually just have intelligent vehicles that are pretty much just stuck doing the same paths over and over again with no one around them most of the time, except for the vehicles inside them. That is extremely upsetting. And then we get to our final type of vehicle. They're the most autonomous vehicle out there. While some other cars, like Mater with his hook and Luigi with his antenna, have hand-arm equivalents, only one species consistently seems to have anything that could be considered real hands. Technically, the most powerful beings in the world of cars. You might not like it, but this is peak performance. That's right, the forklifts are the only beings that can seemingly do it all, because, as we were taught when we were young, being able to grab things is important. So, the forklifts have the most ability to do things, but surprisingly, they don't seem to have the most power socially. Instead, forklifts just end up doing a lot of work. They replace your tires, they serve your food, they control the Eisenhower. They're the ones with hand-type things, so they need to do everything you need hands for, which is a lot in a society that pretty much acts similar to ours. And you never see them in a situation where they're not doing work. Guido, our main forklift, has at least two different jobs. One where he's a tire guy and one where he's a bartender. He's just working all the time. Instead of forklifts, most vehicles in power, or VIPs if you will, are cars. Vehicles like the Queen, the Pope, and rich CEOs are all cars. Even in the Planes movies, which are all about planes, the VIPs are almost all cars. The only non-car VIPs we see are in the military, with Skipper, who was in charge of a squadron of other planes, and the forklift captain of the USS Fleisenhauer, who seems to be in charge of a bunch of other forklifts and planes. So, besides the fact that these VIPs aren't exactly super high ranking, they're also only in charge of forklifts and planes. The only hint at a non-car with a lot of power is the fact that the USS Fleisenhauer is called the USS Fleisenhauer, which implies, based on the fact that it's a bad pun, that the 34th president of the US was a plane.
Quick side note, there's a character called Boat Reynolds who I only remembered while editing. He's a famous actor and has to be pulled around by another car to actually get anywhere on land, which points to a few things. Partially the fact that Boat, which by the way is a terrible in-universe name, is integrated into the car's world, potentially points to the fact that boats don't actually have a thriving ocean society, which makes sense because that sounds like a lot of work, and instead are usually just at ports like how we see them. But also the fact that Boat Reynolds can get pulled around shows that those that are rich and famous can figure out some way to integrate into the car society, but it's not exactly like that's a viable solution for most boats or other vehicles that have that issue.
So what does all this mean? Well, something about society, I'd assume. You can figure it out. I don't feel qualified to talk about society, and we're dangerously close to talking about real life society, so instead, we're just going to stop.